Welcome into the weather review, everyone. I am Gavin White. We are now in the middle of March. Spring officially starts later this week, which is crazy and hard to believe, yet it is rapidly approaching. We've had a few days of spring-like weather here this last week, up in the 70s. It's been sunny. It's been nice. Hopefully it's been the case wherever you are as well. I am very much ready for the warmth. But with it here being mid-March, and with March typically being seen as the start of severe weather season and tornado season, I thought, why not do something different? Instead of looking over some of the weather that happened this past week, which there was some weather, but I wanted to focus instead this week on why is springtime seen as severe weather season? Why does it happen? Why do we get so many tornadoes in the spring? What is it about spring and this time of the year that just excites the atmosphere in a way to get the weather juices pumping? So that's what this is today. We're going to dive in, and it pretty much the way I organize it is there's two main. It's a lot more complex than this, but there's kind of two main overarching things that are primarily responsible for why spring has so much more severe weather than pretty much any other season. And this, I'm not counting hurricane season; that's its own thing. I'm just talking about severe storm, hail, tornado, wind, springtime. That's when we see that. Your crazy strong thunderstorms. Why do we see that? And the biggest contributing factor comes down to it being the battle of the air masses. And we can try to think of this as a natural world war, so to speak, in which you have warming air as we're getting into, referring to the northern hemisphere, as we're getting into springtime. Warm air is trying to push northward, while stubborn cold air is trying to plunge southward. We kind of get that last little bit of cold air still reminiscent from the winter time in Canada, trying to work its way down south, whereas that newfound warm air in the early part of the spring is trying to push its way to the north. And so where do these air masses come from? Well, kind of starting with the warm air, because that's the whole reason we have all this in the first place in severe weather is as a result of warm air. So with the northern hemisphere tilting back towards the sun, it means the northern hemisphere has favorable tilt. It's getting more sunlight. Every day it's getting slightly more sunlight. Every part of the northern hemisphere is getting more sunlight than it got the day before as we continue to get closer and closer to the summertime. So more sunlight means longer days. More sunlight and longer days means more solar in the days. There's more solar radiation reaching the surface than there was for the last half of the year. Is pretty much what that means. So more sunlight, longer days, there's more solar radiation, there's a higher concentration of solar radiation, and then there's just a longer period where solar radiation is reaching the ground. All that combined means that there's just more heating occurring. For the first time in forever, after the cold, dead winter, we're getting more and more of that warmth that we've been missing out on. Now, at the same time, that cold air, it's shrinking. It originates from Canada, but it as we get deeper and deeper into the springtime and approach summer, that the expanse of the cold air is going to shrink, and it's going to move further and further north, and it's going to continue to shrink. Now, it gets so cold in the wintertime because in the wintertime, when we're tilted away from the sun, the northernmost part of the world doesn't get any sunlight for a good chunk of the winter. So all that's with in the absence of sunlight, all that's happened is long wave radiation from the earth is just going out and out and out. Nothing is coming in to replace that energy. It's just long wave radiation is leaving. Things are cooling. It's getting so cold, and there's that buildup of that cold air when we get into the wintertime up in Canada. And that's what causes the cold plunges down here in the States. That's what is a large factor to those cold plunges on the backside of a lot of winter storms when we get into the middle of the winter. Is just that cold air kind of gets wrapped down and is able to come down south. And that's why we get so many that just unbearably cold stuff that no one likes, at least in the northern part of the U.S. Now, with this, we start to see kind of there, with the cold air shrinking as things are warming up and the warm air growing, we start to see kind of clashes and boundaries, and we see sharper gradients, sharper temperature differences across these boundaries. We could call them battle fronts if you will. They're effectively fronts. Whenever two air masses meet, that is a front. Whether it's a cold front, a warm front, stationary front, include front, whatever, it's a front. We can call it a battlefront for the sake of this argument of it being the battle of the air masses. And so with that, that's going to kind of, especially this time of the year when things are more exaggerated, we're going to see stronger stronger fronts thanks to those stronger temperature gradients. So this reintroduction of heat, and then for the first time in months having more moisture available is a contributing factor to this. Now, what's interesting about the air is that the warmer it is, the more moisture it can hold. So in the wintertime, it's cold. It's not holding much moisture, but enough for it to still snow here and there. Now, when we start warming up, the atmosphere is getting warmer. Because it's getting warmer, it's able to hold more moisture. Because it's able to hold more moisture, more cool things can start to happen because there's the moisture available for it to do so. Now, so the natural question would arise, why are these temperature gradients so strong? Why is all of this so much more important in the springtime as opposed to the fall? What is it? Because we know in the winter everything's so cold. You get your winter storms, and that's about it. Everything's just cold. In the summer, everything's just hot. In late summer, you start getting your hurricanes. That's a different type. But everything's just hot. You don't have as much of a variability with it. Now the spring, what is it about the spring that's so different from the fall, where we're getting that kind of change in temperature from cold to hot or hot to cold? What is it about the spring that's more favorable? And it comes down to kind of how something we call the lapse rate, which is how much the temperature changes with altitude. Now, always, it doesn't matter where you are, the atmosphere always cools with height. It's always going to gradually get colder, generally speaking. The surface is majority of places in the world, majority of the year, the surface is going to be warmer than all the air above it. It's almost always, I mean, it's a little, nighttime's different, but talking about the day, the surface is going to be warmer than the air above it. Now, in the springtime, with everything having been so cold, and for the first time we're reaching 70-degree days, it's sunny, there's more sunlight, things are warming up at the surface, it's nice and warm, but the air above it is still very cold. It's been cold for so long, and it's a lot easier to warm up the ground than it is to warm up the air. So in the springtime, with the ground warming up, the air above it is still, relatively speaking, pretty cold. It's decreasing with height at a pretty steep rate. So if there's a large bubble of air and something happens, a front comes through and forces it to start rising, because as it's rising, getting higher in the air, it's so much warmer. It's a warm, moist bubble of air. It's so much warmer than the air around it, because the air around it is getting so much colder at such a faster rate. It's so much warmer, it can just keep accelerating upwards. And that acceleration upwards is going to allow it to condense. It's going to allow it to grow. And it's going to allow it to tap into pretty much storm energy, the energy necessary for strong storms to develop. Because cold air is denser than warm air. It likes to be underneath the warm air. And so with it being so much warmer than its surrounding environment, it's going to keep rising. Now, if we were to compare that to the fall, the atmosphere is still going to be colder than the surface, but we might expect it to be a little more shallower of a lapse rate. It's not cooling as quickly with that because it's had all summer for the air to gradually warm up throughout those months. So same thing, if a front comes through and forces a large region of warm, moist air to rise, odds are it's still going to be warmer than the environment around it, but it's not as drastic of a difference. It doesn't have as much energy available for it to use. And so we see that come to fruition in the spring with having just so much more available energy, because there's so many sharp differences in temperature everywhere, at the surface, in the ground, north, south. There's so many sharp temperature gradients. There's so much energy available that things can take off and explode and turn into strong storms. Now that's discussing the air masses in general. Now there's also the jet stream, which also plays another major contributing factor into why springtime we see so much more severe weather. Now, the jet stream in itself is largely driven by temperature differences, and that dictates kind of where it sets up, way, miles up in the atmosphere. So when you have temperature differences, warm air is generally thicker than cold air. Warm air expands, cold air condenses. And so we would expect the closer you are to the equator, the thicker the atmosphere is because it's warmer, the air is expanded more. Closer you are to the poles, the thinner the atmosphere is because it's colder, it's shrunk. And we kind of get that gradient in the northern hemisphere, you get the gradient as you move poleward, northward. Now with those different thicknesses, we're going to see different altitudes where we reach the same pressure level. Now, we can standardize it to the surface. Typical sea level pressure is about 1,012 millibars. So at sea level, we would expect the air pressure on average to be 1,012 millibars. Now, if we were to go up into the atmosphere at a spot closer to the equator and at a spot closer to the North Pole, and we're looking, for example, say we're looking for the 500 millibar pressure. So we've halved the pressure. Half the atmosphere is below it, half the weight of the atmosphere is below it, half the weight's above it, generally speaking. Where would we expect to find the altitude that we reach that pressure level? Because the atmosphere and the air is just thicker where it's warmer, the spot closer to the equator, we're going to expect to find that 500 millibar level a lot higher than we would expect to find it at the pole, just because of how thick the air is in those regions. And because of that, we see a slope of the same pressure level of where it's 500 millibars up in the atmosphere. So that sloping pressure creates a south to north oriented pressure gradient force, because air likes to escape high pressure and move towards lower pressure. So we're going to see it from the equator going to the pole. We're going to see that slope, and we're going to get air moving that way. Now, at the same time, because there's so much air moving that way, the Coriolis force, or the effect of Earth's rotation, is going to try to counteract it and pull it the opposite direction. So we have the air wants to move north. The rotation of the Earth is trying to pull it south. As a result, we get geostrophic balance, and we have air generally going in an eastward direction. And that's our jet stream, is that eastward movement of the air. Now, that eastward movement of the air, it's always going to be moving to the east, but the question is, it gets wavy. There's different reasons for why we get waves and wrinkles within it, but it moves. The jet stream itself moves how far north or how far south it is in response to large-scale temperature differences. So, in the wintertime, we would expect the jet stream to be further to the south, because just everything is colder and is trying to separate where it's generally warmer from where it's generally colder. So you expect it to be more so in the south. In the summertime, we would expect it to be a little more northward, maybe along the Canada-US boundary, kind of separating the generally cold from the generally warm. And then the spring and the fall is when it's transitioning between that. So in the wintertime, it's probably closer to in the southern US. Summertime, it's a little bit closer, southern Canada, northern US. And then spring and the fall is when it's moving back and forth in between that in response to the changing temperatures. Now, in the springtime, when we're getting that transition, as the northern hemisphere is warming up, we're transitioning from generally colder to generally warmer temperatures, the jet stream is going to gradually start to ride poleward. It wants to move further north because everything's warming up, and it's typically along that temperature boundary. Now, as it's moving poleward, this creates more opportunities for cold and warm air masses to collide and develop a cyclone, which would in turn create a large-scale storm system and potentially to a severe weather outbreak. And so we see that, again, there's natural variability in the jet stream. There's different reasons for why it's going to rotate the way it does and get ridges where it kind of goes up, and then troughs where it looks like it dips down a little bit. But with it moving locations in response to temperature differences, and with heating differences being variable across the continent, you're going to see there's going to be more wiggles in it, and those wiggles are going to create opportunities for air to collide. That cold air, the last little bit of cold air from Canada, and this newfound warm air from not Earth warming up, but from the northern hemisphere warming up again, there's more opportunities for it to collide. And when they collide, it's a new battle of the air masses. We have a front. The front starts moving. There's rotation. That cold air is forcing itself onto that warm air. That warm, moist air starts to rise, and it's so much warmer than everything else around it in the atmosphere. It just keeps rising, starts condensing, it starts growing, it taps into energy. We have a thunderstorm. Now we have a strong thunderstorm because there's a lot of energy. And if there's rotation in the atmosphere, we have the makings and the ingredients for a tornado. And that's generally speaking how we can kind of put all of this together with that battle of the air masses, the cold and the warm, and with the jet stream moving further northward. Now, with this as well, this kind of raises the question, all right, this explains why we see severe weather in the spring, but why so many tornadoes in particular? And it's kind of all this put together. It's that clashing of that long-time dominant cold air mass with the newcomer warm. You can think of, I think it was Logan Paul versus Mike Tyson last year, where you can think of the cold air The dominant cold air is being Mike Tyson. You expect him to win. He's just been there for so long. He's been there all season. You think the cold air is going to win out. And then you have this newcomer, Logan Paul, just annoys everyone, who kind of comes in and is like, all right, what are you doing? And then he wins because things are warming up. We're getting more daylight. But it wins. And we see that warm air starts to creep further north and the cold air starts to shrink. And so it gets a little stronger when they do clash. And then with the jet stream moving up, that provides more energy way up in the atmosphere that storm systems can tap into should they develop, and more opportunities for this cold and warm air masses to collide. And when they collide, there's such strong temperature gradients. There's such steep lapse rates. I mean, everything works out. There's new moisture, there's new heat. Everything ultimately ends up favoring the springtime for severe weather season and tornadoes. So we begin to see this uptick of tornadoes in the springtime, with tornado earlier on in this time of the year, basically March, with tornadoes largely concentrated in the deep south. Why in the deep south? That's where there's the largest moisture concentration from the Gulf, and it's where the most heat is available. The south is the warmest part of the country. It's the first thing to warm up when we start getting into springtime. So because that's where it's warmer, that's where the moisture is, that's where we would expect to see when these boundaries collide, this cold and warm air collide, that's where we're most likely to see tornadoes, climatologically speaking. Now, as we get later into the spring, the tornado concentration tends to shift more towards the plains, traditional tornado alley, and then eventually into the Midwest during the peak season from April to June. And this is a result of, one, the jet stream is now further north, so storm systems are developing further north. But two, heat and moisture have had the opportunity to catch up and work their way further inland. Everything's warming up, and more of that moisture from the Gulf has been able to flow further into the U.S. to create this widespread favorability for tornadoes. So yeah, as I said at the start of this, wanted to do something a little bit different. We're in the spring's about to start later this week. We're in the start of severe weather season. Wanted to kind of talk about why does spring tend to be, within a general sense, why is spring so favorable for severe weather? As always, I appreciate you taking the time to listen. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, comments, concerns. Rate the show. It's always appreciated. I'll catch you next time.